All right, let's jump right into this explainer and take a look at one of the absolute most fiercely debated texts from the entire ancient world. We're talking about a document that has completely captured the imaginations of historians, theologians, and, internet sleuths alike. It's an ancient Egyptian manuscript that tells this gripping story of absolute, utter catastrophe. But what exactly are we looking at here? Is this a literal historical record, a clever piece of political spin, or something else entirely? Today we're going to unpack the source material and uncover the incredibly fascinating story behind the Ipuwer Papyrus.
Just picture this. Imagine carefully unrolling a fragile, ancient scroll and reading these exact words. The river is blood. It is incredibly dramatic, right? It's this dark apocalyptic imagery, and it was written over 3 millennia ago. The text goes on to describe a nation just completely in ruin. The social order has collapsed, servants are rebelling, and disaster is literally striking at every single turn. When you read lines like that, well, it's pretty obvious why this specific text has caused such a massive uproar in the modern world.
And that brings us to the core mystery we are going to unravel today. You've got to wonder, is this ancient papyrus the ultimate historical proof of the biblical plagues of Egypt exactly as they're described in the book of Exodus? Or is it something else entirely? By looking closely at the physical artifact itself, the actual words of the poem, and the overwhelming consensus of modern Egyptologists, we are going to separate the facts from the fiction.
Section 1. The Ipuwer Papyrus discovered.
Okay, let's ground ourselves in reality first and talk about the physical object. The document itself is officially known as Papyrus Leiden I-344 Recto. It is written in hieratic, which, if you're not familiar, is basically a cursive writing system that the ancient Egyptians used alongside their traditional hieroglyphics. Now, the physical papyrus we have today was actually created during the 19th Dynasty of Egypt. And hey, if you ever want to see it for yourself, it is currently sitting safely at the Rijksmuseum van Oudheden. That's the National Museum of Antiquities over in Leiden in the Netherlands.
But what's really wild here is the complex timeline of this text. So the physical papyrus dates to around 1250 BCE. With the poem itself, it's way, way older. Scholars actually date the original composition all the way back to the late 12th dynasty of the Middle Kingdom. So we're talking somewhere between 1991 and 1803 BCE. Fast forward thousands of years to the early 19th century, and the papyrus was actually discovered not by some careful, meticulous archaeologists, but by completely unprofessional traders who were just looking to make a quick buck. They ended up selling it to a guy named Giovanni Anastasi, who was the consul in Egypt for Sweden and Norway at the time. Eventually, Anastasi sold the whole shebang to the Dutch government in 1828, which is exactly how it ended up over in Leiden.
Section 2. An upside-down world.
So let's look at this story itself, known as the Admonitions of Ipuwer. The poem features a speaker named Ipuwer, which was a pretty typical name for that period, and he is just endlessly complaining. But his complaints brilliantly illustrate the poem's central theme, an inverted world where the entire social order has been completely flipped upside down. Ipuwer laments that a woman who previously couldn't even afford a single box, well, now she suddenly owns all this fine furniture. Meanwhile, the once rich man, he's walking around dressed in rags. The natural expected order of society has just been entirely upended.
And Ipuwer doesn't stop there. He gives us these incredibly vivid and tense descriptions of societal collapse. He claims there is absolutely zero respect for the law anymore. And in what is probably the ultimate, most shocking image you could give an ancient Egyptian, he actually claims that the king's burial inside the sacred pyramid has been desecrated. I mean, wow. In the face of all this terrifying chaos, Ipuwer demands action. He directly challenges this figure he calls the Lord of All, a title that might mean the current king or possibly the creator sun god, demanding that he step up, remember his religious duties, and completely destroy his enemies.
But then, right after recalling the good old days before all this chaos hit, the manuscript just stops. The physical papyrus we have is incomplete, so it ends super abruptly. We're entirely missing the final part of the story. Now, based on the structure of other Egyptian texts from the same era, scholars believe it's highly likely that the poem originally wrapped up either with a direct reply from that Lord of All, or by prophesying the arrival of a powerful, righteous king who is going to swoop in, save the day, and put everything back in order.
Section 3. The Exodus Connection.
So how in the world did this ancient Egyptian poem become such a massive flashpoint for modern religious debate? Well, the crucial point is how popular literature often compares this text directly to the biblical book of Exodus, while the vast majority of mainstream scholars strongly dispute that connection. Proponents of the biblical link look at phrases like, "the river is blood," and say, "Aha, proof of the plagues of Egypt." They also point to Ipuwer's frequent mentions of servants running away. However, scholars push back on this by highlighting some pretty major disparities. For instance, the text actually describes Asiatics arriving in Egypt, not leaving it like the Israelites did in the Exodus story. On top of that, scholars explain that the whole river's blood phrase is very likely just referring to the red sediment that colored the Nile during disastrous floods, or, it's just a really poetic metaphorical way of describing intense violent turmoil. It is really important that we note the scholarly consensus here. A lot of Egyptologists heavily criticize amateur documentaries, like Patterns of Evidence, or the work of authors like David Rohl, who really try to force this literal biblical connection. The academic community argues that taking the Admonitions of Ipuwer completely out of their ancient context just to serve modern fundamentalist views is, and I quote, historically and intellectually dishonest. They firmly maintain that this papyrus most likely has absolutely zero relation to the Exodus story.
Section 4. Royal Propaganda and Ethics. So, if it isn't an eyewitness account of the Exodus, or even just an objective history of a bad time in Egypt, what exactly is it? Well, experts like Miriam Lichtheim categorize the text as part of a very specific, well-known genre called lamentation literature. This was a huge thing in the ancient world, actually very similar to Sumerian city laments or Egyptian laments for the dead. The whole point of lamentation literature is to vividly mourn a destroyed, chaotic past, essentially using it as a dark, gloomy backdrop. But the goal isn't just to be sad for the sake of being sad. It's to use that gloomy backdrop to highly contrast and hype up an ideal, perfectly ordered future. To truly get what the author of Ipuwer was trying to do, we have to talk about a foundational Egyptian concept: Ma'at. Ma'at represents order, truth, balance, and justice. It is the ultimate good standing in direct, eternal opposition to chaos. And really, this is the absolute key to understanding the entire poem. It isn't some literal, factual history of one specific bad year in Egypt. It is a deep, thematic exploration of the eternal struggle between order and chaos. It's a story about an inverted world where Ma'at has been entirely lost. And you can see how this all builds perfectly into this fascinating theory proposed by Egyptologist Toby Wilkinson. He suggests that these Lamentations texts were actually highly calculated political tools. Think of it like a playbook. Step 1, depict a nation completely plunged into terrifying chaos and disarray. Step 2, use that terrifying image to highlight the desperate, urgent need for a strong, intransigent king. Step 3, the king steps in, defeats the chaos, and restores Ma'at. Wilkinson actually suggests that pharaohs like Senuseret III, who was already pretty famous for his heavy use of propaganda, likely commissioned works exactly like the Admonitions of Ipuwer to justify their own strong-fisted authoritarian role. So let's summarize what the true scholarly consensus says the Ipuwer Papyrus really is. First off, it is considered by some to be the world's earliest known treatise on political ethics, basically arguing that a good king carries out the will of the gods by reining in unjust officials. It's an absolute masterpiece of Middle Kingdom didactic literature and, yes, royal propaganda. And as scholar Roland Enmarge points out, its setting is actually intentionally vague and ahistoric. By not tying the poem to one specific historical event, the author gave the lament this incredible, timeless relevance that could resonate across countless generations. Which leaves us with a truly fascinating realization as we wrap up this explainer. The Ipuwer Papyrus isn't really about an ancient river turning to literal blood. It's about the deep, universal human terror of society just totally breaking down. It really makes you wonder, right? When we look at all the dystopian fiction and apocalyptic media we eagerly consume today, how do our own modern societal anxieties mirror those of Ipuwer from 4,000 years ago? It seems our timeless human fear of chaos still profoundly shapes the stories we tell today. Think about that the next time you feel the world turning upside down. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive, and keep seeking the truth behind the text.